Russia, the USA, and China are often seen as global superpowers, celebrated for their rich histories, diverse cultures, and vast influence. Yet, behind these powerful images lie lesser-known and darker stories, particularly about how they treat their minority communities. While the Soviet Union had a history of welcoming black individuals, that sentiment has drastically changed in modern times. Many black individuals face deception and discrimination, often lured to Russia with fake job offers only to be stranded once they arrive. Without proper visas, they become vulnerable to exploitation. It's essential to understand that even casual visits to Russia can expose black travelers to everyday racism, complicating their experiences significantly. Today, we're shedding light on the fate of African Russians, exposing the harsh realities many face in Russia. But that's just the beginning. We'll also expose how Russia is enlisting Africans in its military conflicts, sending them to the front lines. And we'll explore how Russia's growing influence in Africa is not just a regional issue but a potential game-changer in global geopolitics. Hell on Earth. For many African migrants, Russia once represented a land of opportunity and hope. But for some, that hope quickly fades as they encounter hostility, brutal discrimination, and in the worst cases, violent attacks. Many describe their experience as hell on earth, constantly fearing for their safety simply because of the color of their skin. While extremist groups like skinheads and neo-Nazis have been prosecuted more often in recent years, the violence and harassment persist. And the threats aren't limited to civilians. Many African migrants report facing abuse from law enforcement as well. For those who came seeking a better life, the reality is often a cycle of poverty, isolation, and constant fear. Trapped in the crossfire. Now, let's be real. Many countries have earned a reputation for discrimination against their black populations. But when it comes to Russia, it seems to take the cake. The center of this issue is Wagner, one of the most controversial private military organizations in the world. Imagine being a young, ambitious student, thrust onto the front lines of a war that isn't yours, all thanks to Wagner's shadowy influence. But why would anyone agree to such a dangerous deal? The answer lies in the historical ties between Russia and Africa. Back during the Cold War, the Soviet Union supported various African independence movements, fostering a connection that still resonates today. Many African students in Russia feel a sense of loyalty to their host country, despite its complicated international role. But Wagner isn't just about warfare. It has deep-rooted ties across Africa, operating in places like Mali, Libya, and the Central African Republic. This has transformed Wagner from merely a military force into a significant political player on the continent. Yet, amid all this, thousands of African students remain in Russia, often navigating precarious circumstances while working off-the-books jobs to make ends meet. Their futures hang in the balance, especially as Russia becomes increasingly entangled in global conflicts, such as the war in Ukraine, Russia's new crusade. But how does Russia lure all these Africans into their country now? Previously, the Soviet Union was seen as a safe haven, but what is happening now? Well, the answer to that is pretty straightforward. It combines religion, geopolitics, and soft power. As tensions between Russia and the West rise, Moscow has been busy building alliances across Africa. One of the tools it's using is the Russian Orthodox Church. You heard that right. Religion is playing a big role in Russia's soft power strategy on the continent. Previously, Russia's influence in Africa has often focused on backing authoritarian regimes and selling military aid. But now, they're also focusing on winning hearts and minds through religion. In recent years, the Russian Orthodox Church has rapidly expanded, with over 200 parishes set up in 25 African countries. Many African Orthodox priests have even switched allegiances from the established Patriarchate of Alexandria to Moscow, enticed by promises of better pay and investments in their communities. But here's where things get even more interesting. Traditionally, the Patriarchate of Alexandria, based in Egypt, oversees Orthodox Christianity in Africa. Russia's move into these territories is shaking up a centuries-old system. But the Russian Orthodox Church isn't just about spreading religion. It's part of a larger strategy, one that includes military aid, disinformation campaigns, and even mercenary forces like the infamous Wagner Group. Russia is positioning itself as a more respectful partner, reminding Africans that it was never part of the West's colonial history in Africa. This narrative plays well in countries with lingering resentment toward the West, especially as Moscow supports causes like fuller African representation at the United Nations. Haunted by history. But can we really blame Africans for being drawn in by Russia's enticing promises? When we take a step back and examine the treatment of African Americans by Western powers for centuries, particularly the USA, the reality becomes rather bleak. The history of systemic discrimination and ongoing challenges faced by Black communities in the West casts a long shadow, making the allure of a new opportunity in Russia understandable, if not a bit tragic. Let's take an example. How would you feel if you were promised free health care for a disease you didn't even know you had, only to discover years later that the very people who made you trust them for that free medical care were intentionally withholding treatment from you? In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service (PHS) launched a study to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis in Black men. About 600 African American men from rural Alabama, many already unknowingly suffering from syphilis, were recruited with a false promise of free health care. Instead of receiving proper treatment, they became subjects in an unethical experiment designed to monitor how the disease ravages the body when left untreated, sometimes leading to blindness, mental illness, heart disease, and even death. What makes this even more horrifying is that even after penicillin was discovered in the 1940s as the cure for syphilis, these men were deliberately denied treatment. In 1972, when the truth finally came to light, the revelation sparked public outrage, and the study was immediately shut down. Congressional hearings were held, and civil rights groups condemned the unethical experiment. In 1973, a lawsuit was filed, resulting in a $10 million settlement for the victims and their families. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment created a deep mistrust between African American communities and the medical establishment, a mistrust that still exists today. It's one of the reasons why many in the African American community were hesitant to take the COVID-19 vaccine, fearing they'd be exploited again in the name of science. And when we said the mistreatment goes back centuries, we meant it. Another dark chapter in American history is the Elaine Massacre, one of the bloodiest racial conflicts in the United States and a horrifying example of racial terror aimed at African Americans. The Elaine Massacre occurred in Phillips County, Arkansas, in 1919, where Black sharecroppers, under Robert Lee Hill's leadership, formed the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America to demand fair wages and better working conditions. During a meeting of Black farmers on September 30th, a confrontation with white men led to the death of a white officer, sparking horrific violence. White mobs, veterans, and vigilantes killed hundreds of Black men, women, and children. The Black community was blamed, and 12 Black men were wrongfully sentenced to death. Despite this tragedy, the fight for justice led to a U.S. Supreme Court decision that overturned their convictions. And even now, with cases like George Floyd's murder still fresh in memory, it's clear that systemic racism and racial violence remain deeply entrenched in Western society. The whitewashed truth, so, when Africans are drawn in by promises of opportunity from places like Russia, who can blame them? So, when Africans are drawn in by promises of opportunity from places like Russia, it's easy to understand why. Faced with centuries of systemic oppression and broken promises from Western powers, particularly the U.S., the idea of a fresh start elsewhere seems appealing. But often, these promises are nothing more than illusions, leaving those who seek refuge stranded and exploited in new ways. This pattern of systemic racism isn't confined to one country or era. It's a global issue that has persisted across time, whether in the U.S., Russia, or other parts of the world. Black people have been fighting against this oppression for generations, and though there have been victories, the struggle for true equality continues. Adding another layer to this complexity, Russia has recently revealed images that have sparked significant discussion, particularly in the Western world. These newly unearthed depictions of biblical figures, including Jesus, suggest that many of them may have had darker skin than traditionally portrayed in Western culture. These images, believed to be authentic and kept under wraps for years, challenge the long-standing Western depiction of biblical figures as white. In most Western portrayals, Jesus is shown as a white man. This stands in stark contrast to how he is depicted in other parts of the world, where he is often represented as Middle Eastern, Black, or even Chinese. So, how did we come to accept the image of a white Jesus? Much of it stems from Europe's influence during the Age of Colonization. Europeans spread Christianity worldwide, but along with it, they introduced a whitewashed version of Jesus that fits their narrative of superiority. This rewriting of biblical history played a key role in justifying European colonialism and the spread of racism. The recent revelations from Russia serve as a stark reminder of how those in power often manipulate history. The stories of discrimination, whether in the US, Russia, or elsewhere, are interconnected by a common thread: the exploitation and oppression of Black communities throughout history. While Russia positions itself as a potential ally to African nations, its actions tell a different story. Whether through deceptive promises of opportunity or entangling African migrants in its military conflicts, Russia's engagement with Africa is often more about self-interest than mutual benefit. Meanwhile, the West, despite its own problematic history, remains locked in a geopolitical tug-of-war with Russia, leaving many Africans caught in the middle. So, what do you think? Are Africans truly better off in Russia, or is the West still the more promising option despite its challenges? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more, and click that notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos.